Our founders debated extensively over which branch of government should have the power to declare or initiate war. Virtually unanimously, they decided, and what was entered into the Constitution was that the declaration or initiation of war would be the power of Congress. Now, we have many advocates, many of whom are here today, who have been advocates for an expansive notion of presidential power. They often argue that wars are not really wars, that they're kinetic actions or drug busts. I think, though, if you reverse the circumstances, it becomes very difficult for these arguments to hold up. So I would ask you, if a foreign country bombed our air defense missiles, captured and removed our president, and blockaded our country, would that be considered an act of war?
Well, I think your question is about and I will acknowledge you've been very consistent on all these points the entire career. So let me, no matter who's in charge. So I will point to two things. The first is it's hard for us to conceive that an operation that lasted about 4.5 hours and was a law enforcement operation to capture someone we don't recognize as a head of state, indicted in the United States, wanted with a $50 million bounty.
My question would be, if it only took 4 hours to take our president, it's very short, nobody dies on the other side, nobody dies on our side, it's perfect. Would it be an act of war?
We just don't believe that this operation comes anywhere close to the constitutional definition of war.
But would it be an act of war if someone did it to us? Nobody dies, few casualties, they're in and out. Boom, it's a perfect military operation. Would that be an act of war? Of course it would be an act of war. I'm probably the most anti-war person in the Senate, and I would vote to declare war if someone invaded our country and took our president. So I think we need to at least acknowledge this is a one-way argument. One-way arguments that don't rebound, that you can't apply to yourselves, that cannot be universally applicable are bad arguments. So my next question would be, let's say it's not a war. We're just going to define it away and say it's not a war. That's one of the arguments. So it's a drug bust. What if a foreign country indicts our president for violating a foreign law? Should we extradite our president, or should we be okay if they come in and get him by force?
Look, I think ultimately we're always going to act in our national interest. And so if somebody comes after our national interest, like the case you've described, which obviously does not exist at this time, but the case you've described, the U.S. always has the right to act in its national interest and to protect itself. So really I don't know about this equivalency. Well, does this justify them doing it? We're always going to do what's best for the United States and America. We're always going to protect our system.
But the point isn't, and you're exactly right, we will act in our national interest, and we should. So I'm not disagreeing with you at all. What I'm saying is, though, that our arguments are empty then. The drug bust isn't really an argument. It's a ruse. The war argument, not a war, is a ruse. It's not a real argument. And we do what we do because we have the force, we have the might, we do it because it's in our interest. So we wouldn't let anybody come in, bomb us, blockade us, and take our president. You know, we've had arguments about legitimate, illegitimate presidents, bad elections, rigged elections. So there's all kinds of same arguments that we've had in our country that they've had in Venezuela. But we wouldn't argue for an indictment. And these things aren't idle speculation. I mean, Netanyahu's been indicted by the ICC. And one of the reasons I object to being part of the ICC, and I would say you and the administration probably agree, is we're not going to let any international council indict our president and arrest him somewhere on foreign soil. We're not going to do that. We actually, most of us probably object to indicting Netanyahu in that way as well. So I think the arguments are invalid. So we did get the legal opinion that Senator Kaine referred to, the OLC opinion, Office of Legal Counsel. And I think a lot of it's been released. Plus, they came to our caucus and talked most of it open about everything they had classified. So I will talk about at least one of the arguments. They say this war wasn't a constitutional war, therefore it doesn't rise to the constitutional notion of us declaring or having to initiate the war. It just doesn't rise. And one of their main arguments was not enough people died. And so there is some number that they aren't specific, but there is some number. I would assume, although I'm not positive, but the 50, 60,000 soldiers who died in Vietnam might be enough for them to call that a war. But here's the problem. It isn't the number, it's that it happens in retrospect. See, our founders gave us the power to initiate or declare war. They didn't give us other powers to execute the war. Those are left to the president. But if we have to wait to see how many people are killed, we have to wait, as they describe it, as the scope, nature, and extent. If we have to wait to see the scope, nature, and extent, the war has been going on for some time. It's hard to vote to initiate a war that's been going on. And we can say this war is over, but we're still blockading it, and we may go back in. But there are no clear answers. You know, we put 2,000, we leave 2,000 troops in. Are we going to call that war and initiate it? So the definition of war is very important. And I think we have to acknowledge the problems with our argument. Calling things kinetic action is a disservice to our soldiers. Oh, you weren't really wounded in war. You don't have a Medal of Honor for war. You have a Medal of Honor for a kinetic action. So I think let's call it what it is, and let's vote on these things. But I think we're in violation of both the spirit and the law of the Constitution by bombing a capital, blockading a country, and removing elected officials. And we certainly wouldn't tolerate it, nor would I if someone did it to us.
But we didn't remove an elected official. We removed someone who was not elected, and it was actually an indicted drug trafficker in the United States. And their system...
Our laws, indicted under our laws. Look, Bolsonaro says that Da Silva is not really the president of Brazil. Our president said Biden wasn't really the president. Hillary Clinton said in 2016 Trump wasn't the president. So you have these arguments, and I agree with you. It probably was, and most likely was, most assuredly was a bad election. He wasn't really elected. But at the same time, if that's our predicate, and you don't have to come to us because it's a drug bust, we're just removing somebody, you can see where it leads to, and it leads to chaos. And that's why we have rules like the Constitution, so we don't get so far out there that presidents can do whatever they want. It is this check and balance. And I would argue for 70 years we've been going the wrong way. It isn't just this president, but it's a debate that I think is worth having.
Okay, let's unpack a question that sounds simple on the surface, but gets incredibly messy the second you start to poke at it.
Yeah.
When does a military operation become an act of war? Is it the number of casualties, how long it lasts, or is it just about who's doing the attacking?
It's a massive constitutional question. And to get to the bottom of it, we're analyzing a really heated transcript from C-SPAN.
Nice.
It's a back and forth between Senator Rand Paul and an administration official about a very specific U.S. operation to remove a foreign leader.
I love when we get into the raw footage.
Yeah.
So what are we actually looking for here? Because war seems like one of those things where, you know it when you see it.
You'd think so. But this deep dive centers on something called the reversibility test. It's sort of a way to test the logic of an intervention.
Okay.
Senator Paul poses a hypothetical. He asks the official, imagine a foreign country bombs U.S. air defenses, blockades our coast, and captures the U.S. president.
I mean, that's an act of war, obviously. Right. If someone kidnaps the president, we are not calling it a diplomatic visit.
Right. And to make it harder, Paul adds these qualifiers. What if it was a perfect operation? What if they were in and out in 4 hours and nobody died? Just a clean extraction.
I still don't see how that changes a thing. It's an attack on the country, period.
And the official had to admit it. He says, of course it would be an act of war, even if it was bloodless. But, and here's the pivot, he argues that the U.S. operation in question was different.
Different how?
They described it as a 4-hour law enforcement operation.
A law enforcement operation using the military.
Exactly. They claimed they were just capturing an indicted drug trafficker and that they didn't recognize him as a head of state.
Wait, so just because we don't like the leader or we decide they're not legitimate, the rules of war just don't apply? That seems like a massive loophole.
It is, and Paul calls it a one-way argument. Basically, if you wouldn't accept another country doing it to you, you can't use that logic to justify doing it to them.
So how did the official defend that? Because that double standard seems pretty glaring.
He pivoted to national interest. The argument is essentially that the U.S. acts to protect itself, and our intent changes the very definition of the act.
So because we're the good guys, it's a police action, not a war.
That's the idea.
Which feels like a way to sideline Congress. Because if it's a war, Congress has to declare it. If it's a drug bust, the president can just do it on his own.
Precisely. And this is where the legal gymnastics get really fascinating. Paul brings up an opinion from the Office of Legal Counsel, the OLC.
Quick refresher, that's basically the Supreme Court inside the executive branch, right? Their opinions are binding.
In a way, yes. And the OLC argued this operation wasn't a constitutional war because of its limited scope, nature, and extent.
Scope and nature. That sounds like lawyer speak.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean in the real world?
In this case, it meant the body count. They contrasted this operation with the Vietnam War, where over 50,000 soldiers died.
So the argument was, what, not enough people died for this to count as a war?
That was effectively the argument.
That seems completely backwards. If you follow that logic, you can't know if it's a war until after the shooting stops.
And that's the core of Paul's constitutional objection. The founders gave Congress the power to initiate war. If you have to wait and count the bodies to figure out if it was a war, Congress loses its power completely.
You can't vote to start something that's already happened.
You can't. It turns the whole system into a retrospective analysis instead of a proactive decision.
And it leads to this shift in terminology we see all the time.
Exactly. We've stopped calling things war. Now we call them kinetic actions.
Yeah, and Paul mentioned that's a huge disservice to the soldiers. You don't get a Medal of Honor for a kinetic action. If you're getting shot at, it feels like war, regardless of what the lawyers are calling it.
But it's not just about the definition of war. It's also about the justification for the invasion itself. Remember how the administration said the target wasn't a real leader?
Right, because of the illegitimate election?
Paul argues that is an incredibly dangerous predicate. If questionable election becomes the standard that lets a president invade a country without congressional approval, I mean, where does that end?
Well, looking around the world and even at home, people dispute elections all the time.
That's the point. He lists off a whole bunch of them. Hillary Clinton in 2016, Trump, Biden, even Bolsonaro talking about Brazil's Silva. His argument is that questioning an election's legitimacy is now a global norm. If that's our trigger for intervention, we are inviting chaos.
So if we zoom out, why should the average listener care about this debate over legal definitions?
Because it really challenges how we interpret the news. We see headlines about strikes and interventions all the time, but this transcript highlights that for the last, 70 years, the constitutional checks and balances have been slowly eroded.
It really makes you wonder if the check on that power is even there anymore.
It does. And I'll leave you with this final thought. If the definition of war relies entirely on the aggressor's national interest and military might, does the Constitution's requirement for Congress to declare a war actually exist in practice anymore? Or has it just been defined out of existence?